I would tell you to be seated, but you're not here, and you're already sitting down probably, so that's all taken care of already. So anyway, if you want to open your Bibles up, I'd invite you to open them up. You can go ahead and open them up to Matthew. We're going to be in Matthew 14 this morning, Matthew chapter 14. And just give you a fair warning at the outset. I did develop a case of bronchitis over the New Year's week. It's non-COVID bronchitis, so I want to set you all at ease. Everybody here in the building is safe and protected. I've had a test, and we know that I'm clear and good to go. But just so you have the warning that you may hear my voice do very strange things as I preach this morning, and I just want you to know that that is what happens when you have bronchitis. So anyway, as you are opening up to Matthew 14 in your Bibles, I want to ask you a question. And that question is really very simple. It's what do you want your life to be about? What do you want your life to be about? What story will your life tell? In the kind of honest assessment of those who were closest to you, as they, at the end of your life, reflect on your life, the life that you lived, what would they say sums up your story? Like, what are the key characteristics? What are maybe kind of the one or two or three things that kind of bring all of the details together? What about those who observe you from a distance? So maybe there are those who are close to you who might say one thing, but maybe those who observe from a distance, would they say the same thing? Would they tell the same story? What about your God? Like, what would God say sums up your life at the end of the day? Like, this is a question that I think about frequently. And for some people, I think very easily in the society that we live in, it's easy to make it about maybe career or accomplishment or achievement, right? Like, at the end of my life, if I have had a good career, maybe I've risen the ranks of some kind of ladder in a company, or I have achieved some degree or level of knowledge, like that would be what defines my life. That would be what makes me impressive. For some other people, it might be their commitment to their family. Like that is what is definitive about them. For some other people, it might be their wealth. Others, it might be their intellect, right? Like, these are the things that we can choose to make our lives about. And then, as we think about us, those of us who are gathering online this morning, those of us who are kind of engaging in our worship service this morning, like, my thought is, if you're going to take the time to tune into a worship service, if you're going to take the time to make being a church a part of your kind of priorities, right? Like, you probably have a thing that we could expect all of us to say, yeah, our life is probably going to be about this, right? So while all of those other people might choose their life to be about, accomplishments or something like this, like, I want to give all of us the benefit of the doubt and say, like, at the end of the day, all of us would probably like our lives to be about Jesus, right? Like, that is a reasonable thing. Like, we want to be, like, we want to do the things that Jesus calls us to do. We want Jesus' grace and forgiveness to permeate our lives. We want Jesus' righteousness to be evident, right? Like, we want to reflect him well. So with that being the case, like, giving us the benefit of the doubt that that's what we want, let's now make our kind of field of vision a little bit smaller. And I want to ask you a question. What were your 2020 and 2021 about? Like, what story was told in those spaces? Like, as much as we may want to see Jesus, it was really easy for us to broadly make 2020 and 2021, which I think it's funny. Back at the beginning of 2021, everybody was saying, oh, this will be a better year, that everything will go better, right? And I'm like, you can't possibly know that. And lo and behold, like, people come New Year's Eve and New Year's Day, like, they're like, let's be done with 2021 and now move on to 2022 because things will be better then. Anyway, that's very interesting. But it could be really easy for us to broadly make these 2 years about facing obstacles, about dealing with disease, about experiencing fear or dealing with loss. And here's the thing, like, those things are going to come no matter how well you live your life for Jesus. Like, you can't live your life so well that you would somehow escape disease, or you would somehow not face any obstacles, right? But here's the thing, like, you can tell a story about Jesus in how you face those things, in how you faced those things. In fact, like, remembering that your story is about Jesus, like keeping that at the forefront of your mind, remembering that even desire to have that story be told about you, that you are about Jesus and his work in the world, that actually can help to clarify what your response should be in the middle of adversity. Like, seeing Jesus for who he is and putting that on display is our existence, right? Pastor Don pointed that out last week. We've been called to be those who would reflect God's glory. That those who actually are the praise of God. That's what we exist as now. And remembering that enables us to tell a story about Jesus regardless of our circumstances. So now that we've asked those two questions, I want to ask a question now. What will 2022 be about? Right? Many of us will want to say Jesus, but that is going to be something that requires us to rightly see him. And that way we might rightly put him on display as we live our lives. So we're in Matthew chapter 14, and we're going to be in verse 22. We're going to start in verse 22 and work our way through this morning. And I'll give us some context kind of to catch us up on where we are in the story. So we catch Jesus and the disciples kind of in the middle of Jesus' mission, his work amongst people. And this is what Jesus knows. Jesus knows that his mission, actually, like the end result of it, while he will rise and while he will become king, like the thing that he is aiming for right now is to become that suffering Messiah that the book of Isaiah told us about. And everybody else thinks, like, if Jesus is the Messiah, well, then what we need to do is make him king now. Like, we need to make sure that we get a bunch of people to follow him, that he can build his own group of followers, that he might even be able to lead a revolt against the nation of Rome, right? Like, this is the impression that everybody else has, but Jesus knows that his end result is different than everybody else's end result. And so this is what just happened. Jesus just performed this massive miracle, the feeding of the 5,000, which we know it wasn't just 5,000. That was the number of men who were there. So we're looking probably more like 15 or 16,000 people in one place at one time. Jesus miraculously feeds all of them, right? He has compassion on them. That's what we see. And that's what just happens. And this is what he knows. After he performs this miracle, after all of these people come out to see him, they're interested in him and the things that he can do and the power that he has, Jesus knows that these people will want to make me king. Like, they're going to want to follow me. They're going to want to lift me up high. They're going to want me to maybe even lead a revolution for them. But there's a few problems with that. Like, first of all, Jesus has made it clear his kingdom is not of this world. And secondly, Jesus knows that his coronation ceremony is going to be a cross. It's not going to be a bunch of people celebrating him and putting some kind of righteous crown on his head so that he can lead a revolt against Rome. So Jesus knows all of this, and we meet Jesus kind of in this moment right after he feeds all of these people. And this is what it says in Matthew 14:22. It says, immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. Right? Like, okay, so all of the language here suggests that, like, right after this miracle is done, right after kind of everything has been done here, Jesus sees the urgency in the situation and things have to move quickly. Right? Because if these people get the chance, they will try to make him their king, and that does not fit with what Jesus knows God is calling him to be. So he sends the disciples away. He's like, we have to move on to the next thing. We have to go to the next place. He sends them to the next place, and he tells them all to get in a boat quickly and kind of just go across the lake, and that he's going to meet them. So he dismisses people. He sends the disciples away. And so verse 23, it says, after he dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. So it's like, let's think maybe middle of the afternoon, early evening, Jesus sends the disciples away out on the river. It takes him the rest of the time from them going out to sea to sending the people away. Like, he is kind of spending a lot of time sending these people away. But once they finally leave and it gets dark, Jesus has to go by himself to pray. Now, this is what Matthew is telling us, right? Like, he's trying to clue us into something specific. Every time Jesus prays, something significant is about to happen. Like, every time Jesus gets away and prays, there is very much a sense of urgency about what is happening. So Matthew is kind of keeping us clued into the fact that the mission is still moving forward. Something significant is about to take place. And so Jesus needs to be empowered for that next part of the mission. So he's up praying. And up to this point, the story is about Jesus and his work in the world. The disciples, they had given up everything to follow Jesus, right? And Jesus kind of gives the disciples this command to, okay, hey, it's time to move on to the next place. So they go across the lake and they just kind of left quickly to take care of this. And so they probably don't understand the urgency totally. Like, they just know that Jesus told them to do something and they're going to do it. They're just going across the lake, right? They've done what Jesus tells them to do. And honestly, they've done what Jesus tells them to do because they know who he is. Right? So, I don't want you to miss the significance of this, because this becomes really important for this whole story that we're about to encounter. You may not understand everything that's happening around you. Like, the disciples certainly did not understand the urgency that Jesus had. But if you follow Jesus, you do know who he is. And sometimes your story being about Jesus means that you do what Jesus says, even if you don't fully understand what all of it means, right? Like, you do what he says, even though you can't understand everything that's happening. And that's what the disciples do. They take off, they get in the boat, even though they don't really understand why. So then verse 24 says this. It says, but the boat by this time was a long way from land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. So it's dark by this time. The disciples know that Jesus is somewhere on the shore still. And the disciples are probably about 3 miles along on a 5-mile long journey, which, for what it's worth, is much slower than they should have been going. Right? Like, it should not take this long to kind of make the crossing that they've been trying to make. And here's why. It actually tells us why they have not been able to make this crossing. It says they were being beaten. Okay, so here's what you need to keep in mind. Everything that Matthew has written up to this point, it's intentional. Like, everything he said is on purpose. Like, there was an event actually earlier on in Matthew that was very similar to this event. The disciples are out on the sea, the waves are going crazy, but Jesus was in the boat with them, right? And they're kind of afraid, they're worried about what's going to happen. And they have to wake Jesus up, and Jesus kind of calms the storm down and says, hey, why didn't you have more faith? Jesus rebuked the waves, everything calms down. So everything about this situation is similar except one thing. Jesus isn't with them. Like, Jesus is away on the shore. Okay, so that creates a challenge for them. And then things are going much slower than they should be going, and that creates another challenge for them. And then the text says that they were being beaten. That word literally means tormented. They were being tormented. The wind was against them. And remember, so Matthew does nothing by accident. In other places, Matthew has used this exact word, tormented, to refer to demonic activity. Right? So this suggests that there is something incredibly unusual about the wind and the way that it is working in this storm. It suggests that dark spiritual forces actually could be working to impede their progress. Right, by making the weather do things that they absolutely did not expect the weather to do. So that's another challenge. Like, you add all of these things up, and the challenges start to mount on top of them. So then take a note. While this may have started to be about obeying Jesus' command to kind of just go to the other side. For the disciples, it quickly morphed into something else. Right? It's no longer a story about obeying Jesus. It's a story about the obstacles they have to face. Right? Like they had expectations about how things should be going. The storm is against them. Jesus isn't with them. They are being tormented by the waves. They might not survive. They sense something dark and unusual in everything that is happening. Right? Suddenly their story became less about simply obeying Jesus and more about the obstacles that they were facing. Like, can I just confess the temptation that this is for me? Like, was Jesus still good and present in the last 2 years? Yes, absolutely. Has God given me and my family such good gifts in the last 2 years? Absolutely. Were there obstacles in the last 2 years? Yeah, there were a lot of obstacles. And you know what? It's really easy for me to let those obstacles become the defining factors of the last 2 years. But does God still accomplish his purposes? Yeah. Does God give me everything I need to remain faithful to following Jesus? Yes. So I think somehow, we have to realize that when we obey God, when we are following God, when we're carrying out his commands, there are going to be obstacles. And it's really easy for us, no matter how good God is, and no matter how much he shows up in the situation, it's really easy for us to let things become about the obstacles more than they do about the simple, faithful obedience. So we see kind of how this continues to work itself out. Verse 25. It says, "In the fourth watch of the night he came to them, walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, 'It is a ghost.' And they cried out in fear." So at this point, the obstacles have become so all-consuming that the disciples are kind of stuck in this mode of terror, right? And honestly, if I were them, I'd probably be doing the same thing. They were clearly struck by the unusual nature of this situation. And that leads them to draw conclusions about what they see out on the water and who is walking towards them as Jesus is coming. In an instant, they're just this does not make sense. This does not compute. And so they are terrified. And then Jesus addresses their fear. As soon as they cry out, in verse 27, it says, "But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, 'Take heart. It is I. Do not be afraid.'" We miss this because of the translation and how things work out. But this is what Jesus literally says to them. He says, "Take heart. I am. Do not be afraid." Right? The command to take heart, it's a command for them to have courage. And how does Jesus give them courage? He says, "Take heart, have courage," and then he says, "I am." I am is the literal name of Israel's God, the God of the entire universe, the one who has made himself known throughout the generations. And when Jesus says it, this is what he's saying. He says, "I'm the one who commands the seas. I'm the one who commands the wind because I am." So, without coming out and saying it, here's essentially what Jesus is saying. Am I the one who spoke things into existence, and existence obeyed me? I am. Am I the one who gave you the command to go out across the water? I am. Am I the one who sees that all of my commands are carried out? I am. Am I the one who works miracles to accomplish all of my purposes? I am. And so when Jesus calls out to them, this is what he's saying. He says, "Don't be afraid, but be bold, because you see me for who I am." So then verse 28, he goes on. And Peter answered him, Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. So we can tend to read this as like Peter's saying, hey, Lord, prove this to me. But that's not actually the most helpful way to read it. The word actually kind of means since instead of if. So Peter is more saying, like, Lord, since it's you. Like, the address of Lord, he's acknowledging him as God, as the one who was working in the Old Testament. And he's saying, Lord, since it's you, command me to come to you out on the water. Like, here's what's happening to Peter as he says this. It says, since it's you, command me. Peter's having kind of this moment of growth. Like, from one moment, he went to being very terrified of everything that was happening around him. And then when Jesus speaks and says, hey, no, this is who I am, Peter realizes that his fear was unfounded. And he wants to actually make that correction in himself. He wants to take care of this right now. Like, he wants to fix this thing that is wrong with him. And so there's lots of questions here about whether or not the disciples actually understand what Jesus meant when he said, I am. But I think Peter understood. Right? He starts to put the pieces together. He knew that Jesus had given them the command to go out across the water. And since Jesus had given them the command, and since all commands that Jesus gives kind of control all of creation, like, they should have focused on the command and the command giver and let that be their focus. They should have remembered who Jesus is. But they didn't. And Peter is not okay with this. Right? So he is emboldened to kind of undo this tendency towards fear inside of him. He wants to correct this thing in himself. He wants to make right what he got wrong in focusing on the obstacles. So he believes Jesus and says, because you are, give me an impossible command. Right? Isn't that the words that he uses? He says, Lord, since it is you, command me. He doesn't say, Lord, since it's you, calm down the water so that I can walk to you. He says, Lord, since it's you, command me to come down to you on the water. Right? Give me an impossible command. Ask me, tell me to do something that I should not be able to do. He asks for something bold, something that requires his faith to be there, to carry it out. He says, command me to come to you on the water. So church, here's my prayer for you as God's church, as God's people. That Jesus would show you something so radical about himself. That in that revealing, you would catch a glimpse of his goodness or his glory or his mercy or his majesty or his power. That somehow in that, you would actually for a moment see Jesus for who he is. And that you would start asking him to make commands of you that require boldness. Now you might say, wait, we know how this story ends though. Like Peter, he's going to fall after he steps out of the boat, right? He's going to put his eyes on the waves, but we're not there yet in the story. We're here in this place where Peter gets it for a brief moment. Like he sees who Jesus is for a brief moment, and he says, command me to do something that seems impossible. And I don't know what that thing for you is. Right? Maybe build new friendships. Maybe you just have a hard time building relationships. Maybe it's build new friendships. Maybe you're really kind of comfortable in your home, and what you need to do is open your home to strangers. Maybe it's a move towards the people who are most weak and hurting in your life with compassion. Maybe it's talk to your neighbor about Jesus. Take on a serving opportunity that seems bigger than you. Create opportunities at work where Jesus' integrity has to shine through you. Maybe it's give away more money than your financial advisor would say is wise. Maybe it's explore kingdom work that you might be gifted for, but you're too afraid to find out. Right? Like there could be a series of things that God would command of you that to you seem quite impossible. But God asks us to do things that seem impossible all the time. And Peter's boldness in this moment was to say, because I see you for who you are, ask me to do an impossible thing. Right? So I don't know what God will ask of you, but my prayer is that we would see Jesus so clearly that we would be ready and waiting for him to command the impossible thing of us, so that our lives can tell a better story about Jesus. So it goes on in verse 29. And so Jesus said to Peter, come. He issues the command. And Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. And he didn't stop halfway. He made it all the way out to Jesus. He got there, right? Peter's faith is strong. He does this impossible thing because Jesus issued the command to him. But he easily forgets. In verse 30 it says, but when he saw the wind, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried out, Lord, save me. In such a short time, Peter forgets because the obstacles are actually very real, and the obstacles are very powerful. And it's really easy to put our eyes and our attention and our focus and put even the focus of the story on the obstacles as opposed to the command. So here's the incredible thing. Verse 31. Jesus immediately. Notice how many times in this story it says immediately, 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 immediately. When Peter cries out, Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. Jesus doesn't say to Peter, "Peter, deal with your mistake." He doesn't say to Peter, "Hey, Peter, I know you were going to go through with this. How it showed you can't do this. You failed." He doesn't make him pay for his failure. Jesus saves him. Now, he has words for Peter to help him understand what happened, but that doesn't negate the fact that in this moment, Jesus saves him. Even though Peter's faith faltered, Jesus saves him. And then he says, why did you doubt? That word doubt literally means, why were you double-minded? Why did you say one thing out of your mouth but then believe something else? Peter, why were your motivations warped? Even though your motivations were warped, and even though his faith was not a full faith, and even though he let other concerns creep into the middle of this moment, Jesus still saved him in the middle of his risk-taking. And when they got into the boat, his power over the storm prevailed. Verse 33. And those in the boat worshiped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." When all of them see Jesus for who he is, they are emboldened as well. They're emboldened to worship Jesus, to recognize who he is. When they call him the Son of God, that is saying you are the one who is carrying out all of the characteristics of the God of the Old Testament in the here and now. That's you. You can do things that no human can do. You are the Son of God. Church, my hope and my prayer moving forward this morning is that we would catch such better glimpses of who Jesus is. And here's why. Because when you rightly see Jesus, he emboldens you to take kingdom risks. Right? Jesus' mission is always going to require things that would seem risky to us. Right? So will you let God's commands guide the way? And trust that God is always working out his kingdom-oriented purposes. So what? So what? Number one, I encourage you to rightly see Jesus. All the time at our church, in sermons and encouragement from other leaders, we hear time and time again, you got to be in the Word. You got to spend time in the Word. You got to understand the word. You got to know the word. You got to be understanding who God is. And there's a reason for all of that. Because the word helps us to rightly see Jesus. Right? The Old Testament points forward in expectation of Jesus' coming. The New Testament works out all of the implications of the fact that Jesus has actually arrived. Right? So regular interaction with the word is what helps us to rightly see Jesus. Like, we're not going to understand the kinds of commands he would make of us until we rightly see him. Right? And we're not going to even be able to respond to those commands or take the risks that we want to see if we don't rightly see him. Right? It is rightly seeing him that helps us to rightly obey him. Right? So I would encourage you, the beginning of the year is as good of time as any. If you've been struggling to find time in the Word or struggling to get into the Word or to orient yourself around it, whatever you have to do to set something up for yourself so that you can more rightly see Jesus as you enter into this next year and the years that follow after that, do it. So that's one piece of this, is to rightly see Jesus. But then the other piece of this is just to trust his character, right? Because he is not only the one in the story who makes commands, right? But as the story progresses, we discover that he is the God who makes commands, who then gives up his very life, who allows himself to be mocked and bruised by the creatures that he created, and died on a cross to save us when we fail to carry out his commands. So yes, he has authority to command. And yes, we should obey him. But as king, his coronation was the cross, because no amount of obedience could make up for our past failure. So he died as a sacrifice for that failure and saves everyone who follows him. So if you've ever if you've never decided to follow Jesus, or if you like having Jesus around for his benefits but aren't actually interested in following and obeying him, those are categories you don't receive salvation. But if you decide to follow Jesus, he extends grace and help. Right? Because we can't perfectly obey. Peter shows that time and time again. And yes, he reaches down and pulls you up in the middle of your failure. So if you find yourself in either of those categories, either the person who has never decided to follow Jesus or the person who is enjoying having Jesus around for his benefits but isn't actually interested in following him, I want to tell you today, because Jesus is who he says he is, decide to start following him. Decide to start following him. So what, number 2? Open yourself up to the risks of kingdom work. For Peter, the kingdom work was he had to write this issue of faith inside of him, right? He had to kind of see that he could trust Jesus. He could believe Jesus for who he is. He had to show that and have that revealed to him, right? That was kind of interior kingdom work. But there is all sorts of kingdom work to be done, right? Our time, our talent, our treasure, those are the resources that we have been given to make an imprint on this world, right? And we sacrifice time and talent and treasure for the things that we consider to be important, for the things that our life is about, right? And to sacrifice is to take a risk, to acknowledge that important thing. We're saying, I'm going to risk one thing over here to make this other thing more important. Right? So when I give up time for leisure to spend that time for my family or with my family, what I'm saying is I'm going to sacrifice one less important thing for something else that is more important, right? I'm going to risk something over here because I know this other thing is valuable. Right? The call to follow Jesus is a call to take risks and order your sacrifices of time and talent and treasure according to his commands, right? According to what best reflects the values of his kingdom. Right? So this call on Jesus followers for us as we walk into 2022 is to see Jesus so well that we take those risks so that our next year or 2 years or 10 years or all of our lives will tell a story about him. Would you pray with me, please? Lord Jesus, I am this morning very grateful that you have chosen to reveal to me who you are. That you've chosen to reveal to so many of us who are listening and watching and interacting, that you've chosen to reveal to us who you are. That you've helped us at various times catch glimpses or visions of that we might rightly see you. And my prayer this morning is you would help us so rightly see and understand that we would become the kind of people who honor and worship and trust you and obey you. And take the risks that would be associated with loving and trusting and honoring and obeying. Lord Jesus, as we are separated and at a distance, I pray that you would shape and form our hearts in expectancy of those times when we will regather. And Lord, I pray this morning that you would help our attention not to be on the obstacles, to not let our story become about the obstacles, but to become about the one who is calling us to do his kingdom work, and to become about simply and faithfully obeying the things that you call us to. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.